So you've got these massive, widespread protests, a really brutal crackdown, and an entire nation that's just on edge. For weeks, the whole world was watching as Iran was shaken by one of the biggest waves of dissent it's seen in years. But now, the streets are quiet. So what does that mean? Has the uprising actually been broken, or is there something else going on right below the surface? Let's get into it. Right off the bat, the message from the Iranian regime to the protesters was, well, it wasn't subtle. This threat, which came out around the case of a 26-year-old man sentenced to death, was designed to be what they call a deterrent element. The point wasn't just punishment, it was about instilling fear. It was about making it crystal clear that stepping out of line carries the ultimate price. And that threat, it really highlights the core of this whole thing. This wasn't just a physical fight on the streets. It was a battle of stories, a battle of narratives, a clash between raw, popular anger and the absolute full force of the state. And this right here, this perfectly captures the information war going on. While those of us in the West were seeing videos of what looked like innocent people just demanding their rights, the Iranian regime was pushing a completely different story. They would latch on to isolated acts of violence to paint all the demonstrators as terrorists, which of course gives them the justification they need for their crackdown. Now, what experts are saying is that this repression wasn't random at all. It was strategic. You can almost think of it like a dial for violence that the regime could turn up or down. So in some places, the police might actually back off and let people chant. But in other areas where the regime felt genuinely threatened, they crank that dial all the way up to overwhelming force. It was calculated. The actual human cost of all this is, well, it's almost impossible to know for sure. With the country basically cut off from the internet and no foreign media on the ground, the estimates for how many people were killed are just all over the place. I mean, that gap between 2,000 and 12,000 is staggering, and it just shows you the chaos and the fog of war that was happening. But you know, this isn't just an internal fight. There's another huge player in all of this, one whose actions or inactions carry enormous weight. And that's the United States. And this brings up a massive dilemma, not just for policymakers in the US, but for the protesters themselves. Would American involvement be the helping hand they need, or could it actually make a catastrophic situation even worse? So for some of the protesters on the ground, the idea of American help is a real beacon of hope. The thinking is that the regime is already stumbling, it's on its back foot, and a strong push from the outside could be that final blow that's needed to bring about real, lasting change. But, and this is a huge but, the risks are immense. If an intervention isn't timed perfectly, it could be just a slap on the water, basically completely ineffective. Or worse, it could give the regime the perfect excuse to open the floodgates and unleash even more brutality, all while claiming it's fighting off a foreign enemy, not its own people. Now, to really get what's happening here, we have to look past the simple black and white picture of protesters versus the state, because Iranian society itself is incredibly complex and divided. While the people we see the most are the active protesters and the hardcore regime supporters, they're actually the minority. The vast majority of Iranians, that big slice of the pie, they're in the middle. Experts call them the grumbling, silent majority. They are deeply, deeply unhappy with the economy in their daily lives, but they aren't out there on the streets actively protesting. And you can feel that frustration everywhere. One expert told this incredible story about a taxi driver who was so fed up with inflation that he was just theatrically throwing worthless banknotes onto his dashboard. See, for him, this isn't about high-level politics. This is about the daily, grinding struggle just to get by. At the same time, it's really important to understand why the regime still has a loyal base of support. For some people, especially the older generations, it represents independence, it represents kicking out the Shah's widely hated government. For others, it provides a crucial social safety net, things like loans for newlyweds or support for veterans' families. That, for them, makes life manageable. Okay, so that's what's happening out in the open. But behind the scenes, there's a fundamental shift taking place, a change in who really holds the power in Iran. For more than 40 years, the world has basically understood Iran through this one lens, as a theocracy, a place where the religious clergy, the priests, have the final say because they rule in the name of God. But what expert analysis is suggesting now is that this definition, it's just not complete anymore. There's been a seismic shift. Iran is evolving into something different, a sort of hybrid system where the military's influence is growing and growing fast. So what does that actually mean on the ground? It means that when it comes to the big decisions, especially around security, The generals of the powerful Revolutionary Guard might now have more say than the clerics do. The center of power is literally shifting from the seminary to the military barracks. And all of this brings us right back to our original question. After all the violence, all the turmoil, where do things actually stand? Has the spirit of this uprising been crushed for good? Well, the assessment is pretty sobering. It seems that the combination of that brutal repression and very targeted intimidation has worked. For now, at least, that huge wave of street protests has been stopped. The momentum is gone. But this is where you see the central paradox. On the outside, the regime looks strong, right? It controls the streets. But on the inside, it might be weaker than it has ever been. By turning its guns on its own people, especially that huge grumbling majority, it suffered a critical, maybe even fatal wound to its own legitimacy. So, while this particular uprising seems to be broken, that doesn't mean the story is over, not by a long shot. Experts think there are a few key triggers that could just reignite the whole thing. A major event from the outside, a crack in the loyalty of the security forces, or another atrocity that crosses the line from making people afraid to making them purely enraged. And that leaves us with the ultimate question, doesn't it? The regime may have won the battle for the streets, but in the process, it's likely lost the trust of millions of its own people. The embers of that dissent are still glowing right beneath the surface. So the question isn't really if they'll flare up again, but when, and what that final spark is going to be.